independence was achieved. 272. The third element was a global war between France, Spain, the Dutch Republic and Britain, with America a zone of a number of different theaters. 272. After entering the war in 1778, France provided the Americans money, weapons, soldiers, and naval assistance, while French troops fought under U.S. command in North America. While Spain did not formally join the war in America, they provided access to the Mississippi River, and by capturing British possessions on the Gulf of Mexico denied bases to the Royal Navy, as well as retaking Minorca and besieging Gibraltar in Europe. 273. Although the Dutch Republic was no longer a major power prior to 1774, they still dominated the European carrying trade, and Dutch merchants made large profits by shipping French-supplied munitions to the Patriots. This ended when Britain declared war in December 1780, and the conflict proved disastrous to the economy. 274. The Dutch were also excluded from the First League of Armed Neutrality, formed by Russia, Sweden and Denmark in March 1780 to protect neutral shipping from being stopped and searched for contraband by Britain and France. 194. While of limited effect, these interventions forced the British to divert men and resources away from North America. 76. American strategy. Congress had multiple advantages if the rebellion turned into a protracted war. Their prosperous state populations depended on local production for food and supplies rather than on imports from their mother country that lay 6 to 12 weeks away by sail. They were spread across most of the North American Atlantic seaboard, stretching 1,000 miles. Most farms were remote from the seaports, and controlling 4 or 5 major ports did not give British armies control over the inland areas. Each state had established internal distribution systems. 275. Each former colony had a long-established system of local militia, combat-tested in support of British regulars 13 years before to secure an expanded British Empire. Together they took away French claims in North America west to the Mississippi River in the French and Indian War. The state legislatures independently funded and controlled their local militias. In the American Revolution, they trained and map of North America east of the Mississippi River outlining state borders in 1782 after state cessions of the Northwest Territory to Congress. Superimposed are 3 colors showing density of settled population, settlers per square mile, SPSM, in 1776. Coastal Boston to Baltimore is green for over 40 SPSM. Then next a thin area in tan for 15A5 40 SPSM for New England. Then that settlement sweeps out for 100 miles west into the frontier of southern Pennsylvania, Virginia and northeast North Carolina A5, and then the 15A5 40 SPSM tan color reappears in a 50-mile half circle around Charleston, SC. The sparsest settlement is colored light purple for the far frontier with 2A5 15 SPSM for modern Maine, New Hampshire and Vermont. Perhaps a 20-mile buffer east of the Allegheny Mountains in New York and Pennsylvania. Then reaching farther west another 100 miles into the Appalachian Mountains for Virginia, North Carolina and South Carolina. British American population density. Highest densities nearby ports in 1775 provided Continental Line regiments to the regular army, each with their own state officer corps. 275. Motivation was also a majority seat. Each colonial capital had its own newspapers and printers, and the Patriots had more popular support than the Loyalists. British hoped that the Loyalists would do much of the fighting, but Hay fought less than expected. 12. Continental Army. Formal painting of General George Washington, standing in uniform, as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. General Washington commanding the Continental Army when the war began. Congress lacked a professional army or navy and each colony only maintained local militias. Militiamen were light-limbed, had little training, and usually did not have uniforms. The units served for only a few weeks or months at a time and lacked the training and discipline of more experienced soldiers. Local county militias were reluctant to travel far from home and they were even available for extended operations. 276. To compensate for this, Congress established a regular force known as the Continental Army on the 14th of June, 1775, the origin of the modern United States Army, and appointed Washington as Commander-in-Chief. However, it suffered significantly from the lack of an effective training program and from largely inexperienced officers and sergeants, offset by a few senior officers. 277. Each state legislature appointed officers for both county and state militias and their regimental Continental Line officers. Although Washington was required to accept congressional appointments, he was still permitted to choose and command his own generals, such as Nathanael Greene, his chief of artillery, Henry Knox, and Alexander Hamilton, the chief of staff. 278. One of Washington's most successful recruits to general officer was Baron Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben, a veteran of the Prussian General Staff who wrote the Revolutionary War Drill Manual. 277. The development of the Continental Army was always a work in progress and Washington used both his regulars and state militia throughout the war. When properly employed, the combination allowed them to overwhelm smaller British forces, as at Concord, Boston, Bennington, and Saratoga. Both sides used partisan warfare, but the state militias effectively suppressed loyalist activity when British regulars were not in the area. 276. A. Washington designed the overall military strategy of the war in cooperation with Congress, established the principle of civilian supremacy in military affairs, personally recruited his senior officer corps, and kept their states focused on a common goal. 281. For the first 3 years until after Valley Forge, the Continental Army was largely supplemented by local state militias. Initially, Washington employed the inexperienced officers and untrained troops in Fabian strategies rather than risk frontal assaults against Britons. Professional soldiers and officers. 282. Over the course of the entire war, Washington lost more battles than won. But he never surrendered his troops and maintained a fighting force in the face of British field armies and never gave up fighting for the American cause. 283. 2 lines of men in continental uniforms, 7 standing infantrymen in the foreground and 5 mounted cavalry in the middle ground. 7 have mostly blue coats, 3 coats are mostly brown, 1 is tanned buckskin, and 1 is white linen. Image of various Continental Army uniforms by prevailing European standards. The armies in America were relatively small, limited by lack of supplies and logistics. The British in particular were constrained by the difficulty of transporting troops across the Atlantic and dependence on local supplies. Washington never directly commanded more than 17,000 men. 284, while the combined Franco-American army at Yorktown was only about 19,000. 285, at the beginning of 1776, Patriot forces consisted of 20,000 men, with 2/3 in the Continental Army and the other third in the various state militias. About 250,000 men served as regulars or as militia for the revolutionary cause over 8 years during wartime. but there were never more than 90,000 men under arms at one time. 286. As a whole, American officers never equaled their opponents in tactics and maneuvers, and they lost most of the pitched battles. The great successes at Boston, 1776, Saratoga, 1777, and Yorktown, 1781, were won from trapping the British far from base with a greater number of troops. 278. Nevertheless, after 1778, Washington's army was transformed into a more disciplined and effective force, mostly by Baron von Steuben's training. 277. Immediately after the army emerged from Valley Forge, it proved its ability to match the British troops in action at the Battle of Monmouth, including a Black Rhode Island regiment fending off a British bayonet attack, then counter-charging for the first time in Washington's army. 287. Here Washington came to realize that saving entire towns was not necessary, but preserving his army and keeping the revolutionary spirit alive was more important in the long run. Washington informed Henry Lawrence, AF, that the possession of our towns, while we have an army in the field, will avail them little. 289. Although Congress was responsible for the war effort and provided supplies to the troops, Washington took it upon himself to pressure the Congress and state legislatures to provide the essentials of war. There was never nearly enough. 290. Congress evolved in its committee oversight and established the Board of War, which included members of the military. 291. Because the Board of War was also a committee ensnared with its own internal procedures, Congress also created the post of Secretary of War, and appointed Major General Benjamin Lincoln in February 1781 to the position. Washington worked closely with Lincoln to coordinate civilian and military authorities and took charge of training and supplying the Army. 292. 277. Continental Navy. During the first summer of the war, Washington began outfitting schooners and other small seagoing vessels to prey on ships supplying the British in Boston. 293. Congress established the Continental Navy on October 13, 1775, and appointed E. Hopkins as its first commander. Winkinsat Smiley. 294. For most of the war, it consisted of a handful of small frigates and sloops, supported by numerous privateers. 295. On the 10th of November, 1775, Congress authorized the creation of the Continental Marines, forefather of the United States Marine Corps. 280. Sail warships at sea with full sail, in the center middle ground, the U.S. ship, in the background, 4 French warships in a haze giving it a cannon salute with gunpowder, small boats also in the water in the middle ground. USS Ranger, Captain Jones. France. Gives the U.S. flag its first foreign salute. A sail warship at sea flying a U.S. flag. USS Alliance, Captain Barry won the last engagement. John Paul Jones became the first American naval hero by capturing HMS Drake on the 24th of April, 1778. First victory for any American military vessel in British waters. 296. The last was by the frigate USS Alliance commanded by Captain John Barry. On the 10th of March, 1783, the Alliance outgunned HMS Cibel in a 45-minute duel while escorting Spanish gold from Havana to Congress. 297. After Yorktown, all U.S. Navy ships were sold or given away. It was the first time in America's history that it had no fighting forces on the high seas. 298. Congress primarily commissioned privateers to reduce costs and to take advantage of the large proportion of colonial sailors found in the British Empire. Overall, they included 1,700 ships that successfully captured 2,283 enemy ships to damage the British effort and to enrich themselves with the proceeds from the sale of cargo and the ship itself. 299. AG. About 55,000 sailors served aboard American privateers during the 14. France. At the beginning of the war, the Americans had no major international allies, as most nation-states watched and waited to see how developments would unfold in British North America. Over time, the Continental Army acquitted itself well in the face of British regulars and their hired German soldiers known to all European great powers. Battles such as the Battle of Bennington, the battles of Saratoga, and even defeats such as the Battle of Germantown, proved decisive in gaining the attention and support of powerful European nations including France and Spain, and the Dutch Republic. The latter moved from covert lies applying the Americans with weapons and supplies to overtly supporting them. 301. The decisive American victory at Saratoga convinced France, who was already a long-time rival of Britain, to offer the Americans the Treaty of Amity and Commerce. The two nations also agreed to a defensive treaty of alliance to protect their trade and also guaranteed American independence from Britain. To acknowledge the United States as a French ally militarily, the treaty was conditioned on Britain initiating a war on France to stop it from trading with the US. Spain and the Dutch Republic were invited to join by both France and the United States in the treaty, but neither made a formal reply. 302. On the 13th of June, 1778, France declared war on Great Britain, and it invoked the French military alliance with US, which ensured additional US privateer support for French possessions in the Caribbean. Washington worked closely with the soldiers and navy that France would send to America, primarily through Lafayette on his staff. French assistance made critical contributions required to defeat General Charles Cornwallis at Yorktown in 1781. 305. RE. British strategy. British political landscape in its 1775 American Empire, AG. 1763 Proclamation Line of 1763 by George III to limit colonial Western settlement. The province of Quebec lies north of the Ohio River, west of Lake Erie and the west boundary of Pennsylvania. The Indian Reserve lies west of modern Roanoke, Virginia, generally following the Eastern Continental Divide. The 1763 Royal Proclamation set the western boundary for the 13 colonies. 1768 Boundary Line Treaty Map for Iroquois Six Nations and tributary tribes north of Fort Stanwix and the Ohio River, and for Cherokee and Creeks south of the Ohio River and west of modern Roanoke, Virginia. The Purple Line 1768 Treaty of Hard Labor is west of the Eastern Continental Divide. The Green Line for the previous 1763 King's Proclamation. The 1768 Indian Treaties, Iroquois west of Red Line, Cherokees west of the Purple. The British military had considerable experience of fighting in North America, most recently during the 7 Years' War, which forced France to give up New France in 1763. 307. However, in previous conflicts they benefited from local logistics, as well as support from the colonial militia, which was not available in the American Revolutionary War. Reinforcements had to come from Europe, and maintaining large armies over such distances was extremely complex. Ships could take 3 months to cross the Atlantic, and orders from London were often outdated by the time they arrived. 308. Prior to the conflict, the colonies were largely autonomous economic and political entities, with no centralized area of ultimate strategic importance. 309. This meant that, unlike